Hello, everyone. It is your girl, Marcie Thomas, and I am so excited to be here with you again. So, come on in the room as we get prepared to have probably one of the most important conversations that we've ever had in this space. And once we get into it, you'll understand why I feel that way. So, if this is your first time joining us, I am coming to you live from the outskirts of Atlanta, GA. And if you're a first time viewer, please feel free to drop in the comments where you're joining from, as well as we get to know one another as we share in this conversation. So I am really excited because we are one of the first people who are going to have an opportunity to have a conversation about this awesome, spectacular book. It may look backwards on your side, but it's Kat Calvin's American Identity in Crisis, Notes from an Actually, I have to look at it. Accidental activism. Make sure I'm not reading wrong since it's backwards for me. But yes, this is a really important conversation. Kat is doing wonderful work in the world, and her book actually just came out yesterday. So as I said, we're getting in on the ground floor. So by means of introduction, Kat Calvin is the founder and executive director of Spread the Vote and Project ID, and the co-founder and CEO of the Project ID Action Fund. She is a lawyer, activist, and social entrepreneur who has built a national organization that has helped more than 11,000 people obtain the IDs they need for jobs, housing, and life, and that also allows them to go to the polls. She is currently working towards the passage of the IDs for an Inclusive Democracy Act. And her book, as we already mentioned, American Identity in Crisis, was just released on yesterday. She is one of Time Magazine's 16 People and Groups Fighting for a More Equal America, 2018 Fast Company 100 Most Creative People in Business, and has been a Business Insider 30 Under 30, and so much more. You have seen her in the New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, Atlantic Essence, and so many other news outlets. Now, along with running her wonderful organizations, she is an enthusiastic photographer, an avid traveler, and more than that. So I don't know how she does it all. When do you sleep, Kat? So she is an Army brat, mostly from Seattle and Arizona, and currently lives in sunny LA. So without any further delay, welcome Ms. Kat Calvin. Welcome.
Hello. So excited to be here.
Oh, yes, and I am excited to have you here. As we were talking behind the scenes, I was just telling you how much I love the book and how it really has blown my mind just in learning something that I never knew. And, things sometimes that we take for granted that you have shown me and will show others through the work that, we shouldn't take these things for granted. So.
Well, thank you. It's so exciting. I mean, like you said, the book just came out yesterday, and so the fact that people are finally reading it and I can finally talk about it, I'm so thrilled. I'm so thrilled that you liked it.
Yes, and congrats all around. So now, tell us, how did you get into the work that you're doing? What was it that prompted you to want to even think about people and IDs?
Yeah, so I started, I had run other nonprofits and really burned out, and I swore I'd never run another one. But during law school, I had studied voting rights, and then I had seen the destruction of the Voting Rights Act with Shelby County v. Holder, and had been tracking the really swift advancement of voter ID laws across the country. And so when the 2016 election happened, it was very clear that the new voter ID laws and the lack of a Voting Rights Act had really impacted it. And so I thought, well, we should have an organization that helps people get IDs to vote. And then within really just seconds of starting and actually talking to people, I realized we have a much bigger problem than just IDs for voting. We actually have millions of people, tens of millions of people who can't get jobs or housing or healthcare because they don't have IDs. And it really shifted the way that my team and I thought about IDs. And it's why, the book says an accidental activist, because I really am an accidental ID activist. I didn't know until I started the org that this was an issue, and then have become really passionate as I have, gone through all of these years and we've worked with all of these people of realizing we have a real ID crisis, and we have to solve it if we want to solve so many of the other challenges that we're facing in the country.
That is so true. Now, how long have you had the organization?
So I started at the end of 2016. So I think
Okay.
that's what, 7-ish
7 years.
years?
7, almost 8. Wow. And you mentioned tens of millions. Now, I've read the book, so I know. But for those who have not heard this, because I shared it with some friends and they were in shock.
Yeah.
So how many, when you say tens of millions, how many people in the US of A are living without ID? Adults, of course, we're talking about.
So it's 26 million American adults don't have photo ID. That is more than the population of every state except California and Texas.
That's crazy.
It's massive. It's 11% of adults in this country.
11% of adults don't have ID.
Yep.
And, you know, as you and I were talking about earlier, we use our IDs for so many things. So we take that for granted. And if anybody's watching and feels like dropping in the comments, you know, what are some of the things that you use your ID for? I'll give you a couple examples because I traveled last week. You know, I had to use that ID to get on an airplane. I had to use that ID to check into a hotel. You know, things like that you don't really think of. If you want to rent a car, you need an ID. And there are so many other things. I said, if anybody has any examples, please, you know, drop them in the comments. If you just think about in your own life where you might have use for that. And so you're thinking, okay, we want to help people vote and get them registered to vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you know, we wanted to help them because we knew that there were hundreds of thousands of people in every state who were registered to vote but didn't have the ID that they needed to actually vote. And as we were talking to people, they were saying, I don't have a job, I don't have a place to live, I don't have healthcare, I can't feed my children, I need IDs for that. And the thing is, you know, all of the fundamental building blocks of having a safe and stable life, you need an ID for, you know, beyond employment and housing, you know, you need it for every social program. If you want WIC or SNAP or your veterans benefits or Social Security, you need IDs for all of that. If you are one of the lucky few who get Section 8 housing, you need an ID for that. And we even, you know, day-to-day survival, most food banks ask for ID before they'll give you food. A lot of shelters ask for ID before they will give you a bed. And so we have this problem where, you know, we've got all of these people living in poverty who are unhoused, who are living in unstable situations, and they absolutely cannot move forward because you need an ID to do anything. If you want to open a bank account, the number of people we have who after COVID came to us and they had stimulus checks that they couldn't get cashed because you can't cash a check with that ID, right? So they had money that could help them get into a place to live or get food or whatever else that they couldn't access. So it's really absolutely everything that you need. You know, even during disasters, people lose their IDs,
right.
But you need an ID for FEMA help, right?
Right.
For a hurricane. So it's literally everything.
Yes, everything. Every little thing that you know, a lot of times we live in this, what we call privilege point. And you even mentioned in the book at a certain point that, yeah, you know, I'm a Black woman. I don't think of myself as being privileged necessarily in the US of A. However, if you've got that little card in your wallet and you can engage in all of these different things, there is a certain level of privilege that you have beyond that 11% of people who can't do those things.
You know, it absolutely is. And the reason that we don't even know about this issue is because it's a privilege that's so taken for granted, right? I've had a passport since I was an infant, and then I got a military ID at 10 and a driver's license at 16. I've never had a moment in my life that I haven't had ID. And we're so segregated by socioeconomic status in this country that you're either in a room where everyone has an ID or you're in a room where everyone doesn't. But there's not a lot of times when, you know, lawyers are hanging out with folks who are unhoused, right, or returning citizens and don't have IDs. And so we never see people who are living outside of our circumstances. And because the vast majority of us have these, we never think of it. And so, you know, we come up with all sorts of different rules. You know, we'll come up with programs and say, well, you need an ID for it or this or that. You know, it's how voter ID laws have been so insidious and so successful is because we just assume that it's an easy thing. And for 26 million adults in this country, it's not.
It's not. It's not. And I mean, there's just so many things. We're going to get into some of them because you have to read the book. So we're not going to talk about everything in the book, people. So just know that, just like if it's a fiction book, we don't give spoilers. We're not going to tell you everything in the book this time. But just in realizing that there are a lot of reasons why we need ID. And you mentioned a couple, like the person who might have been displaced because of some type of natural disaster or different things like that.
Mhm.
What are some of the things, as you've done your work, or what are some of the reasons you have found that it has been difficult for people to get IDs or replace them if they've been lost?
Yeah. Well, so, the problem is in order to get an ID, you need money, first of all. You need a whole ream of documents. We've all been to the DMV. We've all had to take, our folders of life with all of our documents in them. You need transportation. More than 10 million Americans live more than 10 miles from a DMV, and we don't have great public transportation in rural areas, in the suburbs, even in a lot of cities, and so there's all of these things that make it really difficult. If you want to get an ID and the first time in a state, you need a birth certificate. But if you go to Vital Records and ask for a birth certificate, they will ask for your ID. Mm-hmm. And every single, not just state, but every county has different rules for how you do that. So we've had to figure out over the years, how do we help people get birth certificates who don't have IDs in every county in Indiana or Florida, whatever. And it can be really challenging and expensive, right? We've had to pay up to $90 sometimes for birth certificates from different states. And it's an impossible amount of money for a lot of people, but the bureaucracy is really the challenge there. You also need proof of residency. Mm-hmm. And every state has different rules for what they'll count. But if you're unhoused, if you're a recently returned citizen, if you're a senior or a youth living with people, then you may not have all of the required proof of residency documents. And if you live in a state where there's a very small number of things you can have and you need 2 of them or 3 of them, then you can't fulfill that. You also need documents for every single time you've changed your name. So if you are a woman who has changed her name and been married or divorced or widowed, if you're a former foster youth who has had to go through adoption and unadoption, which is my next crusade because that should not be allowed. We have so many people who they've had their names changed, and you have to pay to get the documents from all the county clerks. If you had your name changed when you were a kid, you may not know when or where that happened, but you have to have that document. You also need a social security card in almost every state. Again, try getting a social security card without an ID, right? So it's all of these different things. And then the cost, beyond the cost of the documents, the cost of the birth certificate, IDs can cost anywhere from, if you're lucky and maybe you're in a state that allows for sort of an indigent price, they still call it, which is a little retro. Maybe it's $5. In California, we do have free IDs for the unhoused, but getting the form that's required, it's a gauntlet in its own. But then they can go up to $40, $50, and they go up every year. They went up $10 in LA this year. Who knows how much they're going to go up next year? And so when you put all of that together and you think about it, then you realize it actually makes sense that people who are unhoused, people who are living in poverty, and again, you can't have a job without an ID. So these are all people, for the most part, who are low or no income, people who are elderly or have disabilities. You start to realize we have all these barriers. No wonder there's a group of people. I actually think it's unbelievable that as many people do have IDs as they do.
Yes.
Because it's so hard. And I mean, just getting to the DMV, the fact that 89% of adults in America manage to make it to the DMV it's a miracle. And it's not surprising that only 11% don't.
Right. And, just even as you're talking, I'm thinking about, and of course I have an ID. I was a late driver, so we'll get into that in a minute, because you talk about the youth and how things have changed that way. I was a late driver, but, I did not have a driver's license, but I can remember, having my social security card and things like that. And then once I decided to get my, passport, I remember having to go and get certain documents, and it was expensive because for whatever reason I didn't have the original copy, and I was traveling quickly, so I had to expedite stuff, and then have to go and figure out. First of all, you got to figure out where you actually go to get it, because I'm sure each state is different where you can even retrieve those vital records. And then once you get it, it was like, it might have been $70, $80 just to get them to get it to me in a timely manner. So yes, it's something to think that, a lot of people wouldn't have that. And then, like you mentioned, the elderly or older people who may have been like born at home or, just older and those documents are lost, how difficult it is for them.
It is. I mean, this is a problem we have so often where we have folks who are elderly, and especially if they're older and Black, because if you were born in a Jim Crow town, you weren't getting a birth certificate, right? And a lot of times you were born at home because no hospital would take you. And they didn't have birth certificates. And so, we've, in every state there is, you can get sort of a birth certificate that says that you never got a birth certificate, but they're really, really, really hard to get. And, we had a client who was an older gentleman. He was in his 90s. He was from a small town in Texas. We were trying to get him basically a record that he didn't have a birth certificate. And Texas wanted, something from the pastor who had baptized him in his elementary school. And we were like, they tore down the school and the church, and the pastor would be 300 years old. They're all of the requirements to get this record are impossible. I had a client, she was a young woman, and she was born in a cult in upstate New York in a bathtub in a commune. She didn't have anything. And New York State, which is the hardest state to get an ID or a birth certificate in, we fought them forever because they just didn't recognize the fact that some people are not born in hospitals and don't have parents who keep perfect records and hold on to your birth certificate and your social security card for your whole life. And then you get it as an adult and then you hold on to it forever. I mean, it's another thing that it sort of amazes me that anyone manages to keep that flimsy little social security card their whole lives. And you're not allowed to laminate it.
Right.
And then they're shocked when you lose it, right? And it's just like, logically, it's wild that any of us have these things. But if you don't, it's really, really difficult to get it replaced.
Mm-hmm. And when I was reading that in the book, I actually got a replacement Social Security card recently. I had mine since I was like 16. It was the same card. Yep. And I finally, because it's all, it's tattered, I said, let me go ahead and get a new one just so I can, for what it's worth. But but even at that, you have to have an address where people can send things.
You have to have all the things. And, I this is my job, and I could not find my Social Security card. And I was like, you know what? I would just rather honestly not have one than have to go to Social Security Administration because it's a real nightmare. And after probably 2 years of not knowing where it was, my grandmother just mailed it to me because I guess I'd left it at her house somehow. And I was like, you know what? Thank God, because I still would not have one because I just didn't have the spirit in me to force myself to go to the SSA. It's a very difficult place to be. And they closed for 2 years during COVID. So then you really couldn't go. We make every single step of this process so difficult. But then we require it for everything. And then we act as absolutely shocked when people don't have it.
Mm-hmm. And the United States is one of the few, if not the only country where things operate in that way.
Yeah. Oh, this is a uniquely American problem. It's hilarious trying to explain this to my friends who live in other countries, especially Germans, because they're so efficient and they just no one can understand the concept of people not having an ID because every other country, you turn whatever age, you go to the little office, they give it to you. Maybe it's €4. Usually it's free. But it's just this just isn't an issue anywhere else. But this is America, so we have a lot of uniquely American problems, and this is one of them. But yeah, we are by far the only country that has a problem like this.
And so, do you believe this is on purpose?
No. What's interesting is that there are, historically, there have been moments when there was, increased requirement of vital documents for things because it would sort of exclude or control people of color or things like that. But the problem with this many people not having IDs is actually because of 9/11. And because what we do in this country is we react by overreacting and not considering the people who would be caught in the crossfire. So the 9/11 terrorists had something like 36 IDs, state IDs, that they had gotten by going through the legal channels. And so this is where Real ID comes from. The 9/11 Commission recognized that this was an issue, which it absolutely was. And then they said, well, we're going to implement this Real ID thing, which, as we can see, it's 23 years later, and it still hasn't been done. And so, but what happened was every single state decided overnight to make it more difficult to get an ID. And the thing is that for most states, what requirements you have for documents or things you need for an ID, it's not statutory. It's just a person. It's usually the head of the Department of Transportation, or it's literally just Muriel Bowser in DC, or it's just the mayor. But it's usually just a person, maybe a committee. And so they overnight made it really, really hard to get an ID. And this is why there's so many seniors who never had birth certificates, who never had a problem before. And all of a sudden, like, why this is a new issue, and also why voter ID laws came along, because it was a very opportunistic way of taking advantage of this issue. And it's what we do, right? Like, we have a problem, we react really, really, as far to the edges as we can, and then we just never think about who we affect, because we don't care, right?
Right.
I think it's actually worse that it's not on purpose, because it's not even that we're trying to exclude people, it's that we don't care about them in the first place, right? These are the bottom 11% of the country, the most vulnerable, the people who, I personally think we have a caste system in America, and that they are the untouchables, right? The people we just walk past and they're sleeping in the streets, or they're dead on the sidewalk, and we don't care. So we don't even bother to think about them when we're making policy decisions, like making IDs so that they can have a place to sleep indoors more difficult. We don't even think about them.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that really got me. There are a bunch of different categories of people that you mentioned throughout the book that, are kind of the forgotten people. But just back to the statement about being a child or a teenager or whatever the case may be, I found it interesting that less teenagers are getting driver's license nowadays, because oftentimes that is the first, maybe your little learner's permit, which may or may not have a photo. But usually a driver's license is a part of the rite of passage, and would have been the thing that got a teenager, a 16-year-old ID for the first time. But your book is saying that children aren't getting them like they used to.
No, the numbers of young people getting driver's licenses has significantly declined, which makes sense if you think about it, right? Like, first of all, cars are expensive and none of us have any money. Insurance is expensive. Gas, I mean, I live in LA. Gas is $1 million a gallon. But also young people are really more conscious of the climate. I'm more conscious of, they have very low amounts of money, and also are doing more virtually. And so they're not needing to go out as much, so that it's such an imperative. And so we're seeing numbers really drop. But we're not informing young people that, hey, there's a state ID that you can get, right? So I was going around high schools in Dallas talking to classes of seniors and asking, raise your hand if you have an ID. And maybe a third of the kids would raise their hands. But then, this is a huge problem, because not only do they need, they need IDs for jobs if they're starting out, they need IDs to take the SATs. We work with the Detroit public schools, and we've had kids who have been sent to us because they went to take the SAT and they didn't have a photo ID. And not every high school gives kids student IDs with their photos. A lot of high schools can't afford that. And so then kids are being rejected because you can't take the SAT without your ID. And so, luckily there were kids in school districts we work with that we can help. But like, we don't think about the fact that we have these young people who are leaving high school and trying to start their lives and need an ID. You need an ID to, go to take classes in college. Right. I've been taking classes at LA City College, which is this our awesome community college system in film, because I want to make a documentary about IDs. And I was halfway through 2 classes and I got a call because they needed my ID. And I was like, first of all, what happens if you don't have an ID? Which I always ask. I am now the annoying person who always asks this.
Right.
The person on the other end never does. He's like, I don't know, you just can't take classes. And I was like, well, that's a problem. But also, I was halfway through the semester. What if I had put all of that work in, and was trying to lift myself up? And LACC is incredible because they're so well funded. They have really good scholarships. So it's actually really possible to get an education for free to help lift yourself up. But if you don't have an ID, that you can't do it. And we've got all these young people, who are trying to get an education, and no one is helping them get an ID because we think driver's licenses are nothing. And so it's become actually a problem. I think that we do not understand what a significant issue it is. Because we're not paying attention to this ID issue, but I'm in schools a lot and it's a big problem.
Right. I can only imagine. And I mean, even, and this is kind of a sad thing, but something I found out a couple of days ago, when you think about when people, for whatever reason, runaways, missing, whatever the case like that, if they don't have a way of where they may have had some identification on them at some point,
Yep.
you don't know who these children are, or even adults that might disappear if they don't have any type of ID or have never had any ID that could be traced. So it's
Mhm.
just important in so many different ways. But just thinking about specifically the unhoused, because we've mentioned that a couple of times, unhoused or homeless, however people see that. And I know I'm in the Atlanta area, and there is a large population, just as I know that there is in LA and a lot of other major metropolitan areas. But I just found it opened my eyes. As I said, the book blew my mind overall, but it really opened my eyes to think that, wow, if someone is unhoused and perhaps they have an opportunity to go and stay in a shelter for the night, if they don't have ID, they'll get turned away.
Yeah, so there are so many shelters and food banks that require ID, and it's not because necessarily, and usually because the shelter or the food bank wants to. It's usually a requirement of government funding, because often governments, especially if it's a county government funding, state government, they will require that you only serve people that live in certain zip codes, right? Or sort of whatever the standard is, and so they make these shelters and food banks require ID. So again, it's not even that there's anything nefarious from the shelter's perspective, but they have to, adhere to the requirements of their grants. But what it means is that very, very often you have people who are turned away because they don't have ID. And there's a story that I tell in the book about a person who was in West Virginia, and it was winter, and they tried to get into a shelter, and the shelter had to turn them away because they didn't have ID, and they actually froze to death on the doorstep of the shelter. And then that shelter found us, and we started working with them to try to make sure that doesn't happen again. But this is why, I always say, IDs are life or death, but they really are. When you're living in the streets, whether it's winter, whether it's somewhere in LA, whatever, it's life or death. And I think that for me was a moment of really showing me how serious it was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's just one of the populations. And there are a lot of veterans that end up in that situation. I was in the Air Force for 7 years.
Oh,
So, I have a heart for veterans, definitely. But to think that the people who went and served their country now, are don't have housing, can't get housing, can't take advantage of the GI bills or all these other things that, kind of get pushed at you, or you hear about the press that you hear about joining in the military or, being in the service. But there are people who get out and can't access those things.
Yeah, we have a really massive issue with veteran homelessness in this country. It's shocking and it's infuriating. I mean, on so many levels. Yes, because if there is one group of people who should at least have immediate access to government services and IDs, it's veterans. I grew up on Army bases. Everyone in my family's in the military, which is why I'm not, because I would have been put in the break day one. Like the first time someone tried to tell me what to do, I would have been like, you may as well arrest me. But so knowing the sacrifice that is made and the promises that we tell veterans, and particularly because in this country we recruit people who are from poor areas, people who are people of color, and we tell them you can be in the Army, and we've all seen those fancy commercials, and then you're going to work on some fancy computers and this and that or whatever. Then that's not the case for so many veterans, and the percentages of veterans who are unemployed significantly increases based on whether or not they are white or Asian, or Latino, or Black, or particularly Pacific Islander. I'm a Native American. And so, we owe them anyways. But I think that for me, the other thing that makes it infuriating is veterans are the one group of people that both sides of the political aisle pretend to care about.
Right.
And if they're not even making sure that veterans have basic IDs, you can't even get services at the VA without an ID. You can't get, your veterans benefits without an ID. And both sides of the aisles pretend to care about vets, but don't care enough to make sure that they have an ID and housing. It's infuriating. We've got a bill in California right now to make IDs free for all veterans. And, I'm having a lot of conversations with folks who serve veterans who are like, well, I don't know if we need this, but then sort of later say, well, but they do need an ID to access our services. And I'm like, yes, that's
the point.
Exactly the point. And if we're not helping vets, then who are we helping? We're not going to convince anybody in any state legislature on either side of the aisle that they should be helping foster kids or seniors or domestic violence survivors if they don't care enough to help veterans. And so it's such a canary in the coal mine for me of services that we don't care enough to give to people who literally not only served our country, but were promised that if they did that, they would be taken care of.
Right. And you are so right. Because as a veteran, I didn't stay in for 20 years, but for the time that I did stay, I couldn't get any services without that ID. Yep. And yes, I have a little, because you talk about in the book, I have a little card that shows that I can get some health services, but that's the extent of it. So if I wanted to go, open a bank account or, anything like that, it wouldn't even be possible for me to do that with that ID. One of the things that really stood out, though, in all of these different scenarios is the fact that in most cases, the government has the information to be able to give people IDs, yet they make people jump through hoops to get them.
Yeah. I think that one thing that COVID really helped with is, I for years have had people say like, well, the government, it's so hard and they don't have all the information. I'm like, yeah, they do. But then COVID happened and the government didn't need us to fill out a single form or ask us a single question to know where we lived, how many kids we have, how much money we make, and then determine how much money they were going to send it and either get it into our bank accounts or send us a check, right? Like that all happened and we didn't have to do a single thing. They know everything. It's the government. Every teenager in Kazakhstan has your DNA. You think the government doesn't know everything about you? They do. And so this idea that, it's too complicated or it's too hard or the government doesn't know or, whatever, it's not true. We could all go in today. Like right now, the NSA knows exactly where we are and what we're doing and what kind of tea I'm drinking, right? We could make sure everyone has an ID. We don't want to, but the technology exists. And that's why, spoilers, I have a solution in the book and it wouldn't be that expensive. It wouldn't be less secure. Like we have all of the technology and everything we need to give everyone an ID right now. We just haven't made the choice to do
it. Which is political in its own way. One of the other groups you mentioned that is meaningful to me because I once used to be a CASA, which is a court-appointed special advocate that helps children that are in foster care. It's what happens with the children who stay in foster care and age out, and sometimes what is or isn't available to them.
Yeah, this is another group that I think it's so frustrating because they are children who are in the government's care. And so again, I think children we have the utmost responsibility for. And, even though they're children, former foster youth, when they age out, they're supposed to get their IDs and documents. They often don't. And when they do, they former foster children end up being unhoused at incredibly high rates, which means that even if they do happen to get some documents, once you're unhoused, once you don't have a safe place to keep things, obviously they get lost, they get stolen, they get swept by the police a lot, they get wet in rainstorms, right? Like it's very hard to hold on to things. And then it is not only really difficult for former foster youth to get them replaced, but there are so many complications. We have so many clients who they don't know, again, when their names were changed, they don't know where they were born, they may not know their social security number, like so many different complications. And yet this is a group who we know need a lot of extra help and support to be able to live successful and stable lives after foster care, and we're not helping to make sure that they do that. And again, same thing, like what if they could go to community college? There's so many things they could do, but they need these documents and they're not getting them, and it's so complex. And we work with this really amazing organization that helps former foster youth get jobs, because one of the biggest questions that they get from the foster youth they're working in are, can you help me get an ID? And it's so frustrating, because we all know. I was just reading this really great article about how so many of our pop culture heroes are foster youth, right?
Oh,
If you look at
I
like
know.
Spider-Man and Superman and like a lot of superheroes, and because they have to do so much more work to find their identity, and necessarily stories of kids who may come from know who their families are and etc. And it was really interesting to me, but it also just, I think, really for me, what I thought is that this is why we have so much more of a responsibility to these kids, is because they have to do so much more work already just to survive, just to be stable. The least we can do is make sure they have the documents that they need.
Yeah, that's something, because of course, since I mentioned I was in that and went to a couple of conferences and stuff, I would hear about programs, as they're aging out and stuff like that. And at that time, this was several years ago, I don't think they really talked about ID, but I hope that that more of those programs are starting to do that now, because it's so important. Another group is returning citizens, people who may have been incarcerated and they're trying to get back into the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, shocker. We don't do a lot to help returning citizens successfully reintegrate. If you're just finding that out, welcome to America. It must be your first day. And so, we put returning citizens into prison. And so a very interesting study just came out in LA that showed that 67% of people who were incarcerated were homeless when they were arrested, right? So we have this homelessness to prison. It's not even a pipeline. It's just a rebound. So they go back and forth and back and forth. So many of our clients were unhoused and then in jail and then unhoused and etc. And so they may be going in without any ID or documents. If they're not, then they can get thrown away or they expire. And most jails just release you. And they say, well, go get a job and get a house and stay away from all those people who got you in trouble, which might be your friends and family. And we're not going to help you with anything. Right. And you can't get a job or a house without an ID. And so then what are they supposed to do, right? So then they end up unhoused again, or they end up back in jail. And it's this cycle. And so we work with a lot of organizations that work with returning citizens. We also work directly with departments of corrections to try to get IDs into people's hands as closely to them being released as possible. Because it's the same as, without that, you're not going to be able to start over. And, we have this problem in this country where we don't want to hire anybody who's been incarcerated and has served their time. So it's hard enough to get restarted if you can't get a job, right? If you have all of these things working against you. And then the state, which held you, doesn't give you a document from the state. And even the programs we work with the Direct Department of Corrections to get IDs from their state, we have to pay for them because nobody in the state, and we're like, you're the state working with the state. I am a girl in my bedroom. Like, what are we doing here? But we just don't care enough to make sure that folks that we are serving, or that who have served their time, have what they need not to go back. But we talk all the time about recidivism rates, right? And anti-recidivism, but one works with the other. So it's just another case of us just really choosing not to see what the initial key is to opening up the door to success for a group of people.
Right. And there are so many stories. That was one of the things, just besides the facts and understanding these different, categories or segments of society, some of the stories, like I know there, and you'll tell it better than me since you wrote it. A gentleman who may have gotten a DUI early on and spent almost 20 years without ID. Tell us a little bit about that story, because that was amazing to me.
Yeah, 40 actually. So Chris, who worked for us for a long time in Orlando, called me one day and he was like, "You got to talk to my client. I just got him an ID. He hadn't had one for 40 years." And he, was young in his 20s and drinking and driving, which a lot of people do. But he got pulled over and he got a DUI. And so what? Another thing that we do, and this affects really every returning citizen, and is that we put fines and fees on your ability to get a new driver's license. And luckily, this is something that a lot of states are starting to realize is an issue. Well, a lot, like 15, but it's growing. And are trying to reverse, because we've had clients and we have a whole fund just to try to raise money to help people pay their fines and fees, because it's so far outside of our budget. And because we'll have clients who have thousands and thousands of dollars of fines and fees. It's almost impossible to get out of jail or prison without a fine or fee. But also we'll put fines and fees like if you have a DUI or whatever. And so he got a fine and it was way more money than he had. And, that grows, and he just was never able to pay that off. So he was never able to get a new ID. And so by the time we met him, he was an older gentleman. He'd been living with his mother all of this time, and he'd been working, under the table jobs. And he just wanted an ID because he wanted to be able to start collecting benefits, and because he knew when his mother passed away, he was going to have to find a place to live. And when I spoke to him and I asked him, how would your life have been different if you'd had an ID all of this time? And he said, well, I would have had a life. Everything would have been different. And that's something, so many of our clients say to us. They say, I'm a person again when they get their IDs. The number of grown men who have been at my table or in my car bawling because I was able to get them a birth certificate, which they hadn't had in decades, or because we were at the DMV and they had a new ID in their hand and they just couldn't believe it because it had been so long, and you just can't do anything without it. And for me, I think that the idea of someone losing literally their entire life,
right,
because they don't have this dumb little card that we could easily give them that costs nothing to produce, but that means everything. It's his whole life was gone. And it's so frustrating. And it's those stories are why I'm just constantly pushing, like, we have to make sure everyone has an ID, because how can your whole life be stolen because you don't have that one little card?
Right. Another story, and then we can talk about the work and some of the things that you're doing to make things better. Another story that really, there's so many, but another one that really jumped out at me was one where there was a couple who wanted to get married.
Yes. Turns out you need an ID to get married. It's the one thing I will never use my ID for, but you do. And what's funny is that it's not funny, but it's sad, but this gentleman, it's in the foster child, or the chapter about youth, because he hadn't had an ID, and he didn't have his birth certificate. He had been either a foster child or adopted, and didn't really know why until we got him his birth certificate. And I will not tell you why. You can read it in the book. But he wanted to get married. And that's so legit. And he's actually not even the first couple. We had two veterans, and they had both gone blind because of injuries due to their service, and met at a conference for veterans who were blind, and fell in love and wanted to get married. And it's happened multiple times where there's like, I need an ID, like, you fall in love, you want to get married. Women, you probably shouldn't. It's not great for you. But like, if you want to,
I love you.
And you want to start your life, and to not even have the ID to do that I think it shows for me, like, how fundamental this is. Like, just every little or big life decision you want to make, you need an ID for it. And so, we were so happy to be able to help. But I think that, the thing particularly with that gentleman that made me really think, like, we've got to help kids I think about this so often, is, if everyone had an ID, then, I mean, first of all, my organization wouldn't have to exist, right? But also there's so many others that wouldn't have to, because then everybody could just get a job and he could just get married, and his whole life would have been different, because again, he would have been a former foster youth who just had an ID and was able to get a job, and all these things. And so I think that we miss some of the really fundamental things that you can't do. And for me, like getting married, it just seems like, everybody can just drive through a church in Vegas and get married, but you can't. You need an ID.
You need an ID. You need an ID. That's something. But just thinking about the work in and of itself. So in order to do this work, obviously you have lots of different partners that you work with to kind of find out who needs it. And then, they get with the people and find out what the needs are and then start the process. So I was going to ask if there's an average time, but I know there probably isn't because each case is different.
So it ranges. We say our average time is 2 to 4 weeks. The way it works is when we meet with someone, we do intake, we find out, all right, you're in, Louisiana, you need these 4 different documents. What do you have? What do you not have? Sometimes we get really lucky and they have everything and we just have to give them a ride to the DMV and pay for it. That's a great day. That's not usually the case. 57% of our clients don't have birth certificates. 15 to 18 million American adults don't have access to their birth or citizenship paperwork. And so that's 6 to 8% of American adults. And so a lot of, for us, given the population we work with, 57% don't. So then we have to do the birth certificate route. Depending on the state and even the county will depend on sort of how long that takes and whether we can, go online, answer some questions, fill in some information, and order it and wait for it to come in. Sometimes we have to do a limited power of attorney, or I have to use my bar number and swear on my bar number and send in paperwork to say it's this person, and we have to get things notarized, et cetera. So the process is different for each person, but then we have to wait for the birth certificate to arrive. Some places, there's a small town in Utah, they get to you the next day. They're amazing, right? Some places it takes a couple days, maybe a week or two. Some place, New York, you're waiting 5 or 6 months. There are a lot of states where it takes several months. And so then it's just a waiting game, waiting for that. Same thing if you need to order name change verification or a marriage license or things like that. The ordering it doesn't take as long. The waiting takes forever. If you need a social security card, the waiting takes forever, right? And so there's a lot of time in between. Once we have everything, then we're able to, let them know. And we're dealing with a population. Only 1% of our clients have regular access to a phone. So we have a lot of, getting in touch, staying in touch, being able to find folks. We lose clients all of the time, or they'll sort of disappear or come back in a year or this or that. But we have to get back in touch with them and have all of their documents. And then we can take them to the DMV and get them their ID. But it really depends on what is that document waiting time, because we can only act based on the timeline of whatever bureaucracy we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. That's something. So you're figuring out where it is, getting it, waiting for it, and then being able to actually take people and pay, help them by paying for it. I mean, the work that you're doing is just so powerful. And everyone, I'll show you the cover again, just reading the book and really diving in, because you just don't know about what's going on around you, and you see different people and you might have preconceived notions about why they're doing or not doing a thing, but it could be as simple as, I don't have ID to go get a job, or go get housing in a certain place, or be able to feed my children, or go get medical care. People don't always have the very basic thing that they need.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I love is that in addition to the work that your organization is doing in helping people to get the IDs, there's another arm that's actually dealing with the political side.
Yes. Yeah. So Project ID Action Fund is our 501c4. So it's our political arm. And, we have the goal is to make sure everybody has an ID. I cannot get 26 million people individually IDs. I once made a spreadsheet to figure out how to do that, and then I just cried for a really long time and ordered a pizza. Like, it's not possible. So then I said, all right, well, we've got to figure out a way to do this through policy. And so that's what we're doing with Project ID Action Fund. So we do a few things with the Action Fund. We do have a bill in Congress, the IDs for an Inclusive Democracy Act, which would solve this problem. It would create a free and optional federal ID for everyone in the country over 14. It would be distributed not in DMVs, but in post offices and libraries, which are much more accessible to Americans. And it would, because it's federal, you could use it for, on your I-9s for jobs, you could use it for housing, you could use it for social services, and you wouldn't need a new ID every time you move to a new state, which requires all of that new documentation because it's a federal ID. So we're working really hard to get that passed. But at the same time, we're working on state legislation. So we have a bill in California that just made it to Gavin Newsom's desk, and I'm really hoping he signs it. Do me a favor, Gavin, get that signed. That would make driver's licenses, which cost $41 in California, would make them free for all unhoused Californians. And it would make birth certificates free for low-income Californians, which is huge because birth certificates, they cost about $30 each. And, that's expensive for one person, but I've had single moms with 3 or 4 kids who need birth certificates for each of their kids in order to put them in school and for, whatever, for healthcare, for whatever reasons. And when you're adding up $30 times 2, 3, 4, 5 people, it's really expensive. And, so much about the work that we're doing is helping folks get ID so that they can get homes and jobs, but also so that they can retain their homes, right? And then they can retain their jobs. And so we're really excited about that bill. We've got another one, like I said, that would make IDs free for all veterans. We're working with legislatures in other states trying to get bills up across the country. We're also working with local politicians, we're working, we endorsed 2 candidates in New York City Council who both have really incredible legislation in front of the City Council, one of which just passed that would increase access to the ID NYC, the municipal ID, which is a really, really good option for folks who can't get the state ID yet. And then we also endorse pro-ID candidates, which a lot of times means telling a candidate that they are pro-ID and why we think so and convincing them, and then getting them to add IDs to their platforms and, then working with them to help them get elected so that we can then have them help to write legislation. So we are trying really hard to eliminate the problem on the policy side while we are supporting people day to day on the ground.
Right. Yes, because like you said, 26 million is a lot, and you could only do but so much with your team. About how big is your team?
So we are a small team. We are right now, we have about 5 people. During election years. Some years we sort of go up to 20, but it sort of depends on what's happening at the moment. But it's a pretty small team of really mostly women. If I'm hiring, it's going to be mostly women. And we live all over the country. And then we have hundreds of partners on the ground all over the country and some amazing volunteers who all work with us to help get IDs.
That's just so powerful. And I wanted to share this. I snuck it up there briefly a little while ago and took it back down. But, ID for ID. If people visit there, what is it that they can do to help? That's on the legislative side, correct?
Yeah, so that is the bill specifically for the IDs for an Inclusive Democracy Act. So you can go to that. You can see a lot more about the bill, but also, very importantly, there is a page where you can get in touch with your members of Congress to ask them to support the bill. So we've got scripts, we've got ways for you to call, text, email, write, go outside of their houses with a picket sign if you want, whatever you want to do. Don't do that. Right. But we want this to be something that everyone gets involved in, because that is the way for us to get Congress to move on legislation. So if you go to idforid.org, there are all sorts of things that you can do. You can also donate so that we can keep trying to do this work. We've got some cute little swag. There's all sorts of stuff.
All right. And I just think that that's powerful that, because we have to work together because, as I told you earlier, Kat, as soon as I read the book and, got through it, it's like, ooh, how can I help? What can I do? How can I figure something out? Because a lot of times, just yesterday, I believe it was like voter registration day. And
Yeah.
it's like, okay, yay, people get excited about we're registering people to vote. We're registering people to vote. But then if you register them and they don't have ID.
Right. Yeah. And it's a big challenge, so there's in every state there are hundreds of thousands of people who registered who can't vote. So in Wisconsin it's over 200,000 people, in Virginia 225,000, like every state. And one of the things that we see when we look at voter turnout is that if you break up voter turnout into a pie chart, there's people who voted for candidate A, people who voted for candidate B, people who didn't vote and aren't registered, and then the biggest piece of the pie is always people who were registered and didn't vote. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but not having an ID is a really big one. And so we like, obviously voter registration is great. You need it in every state except North Dakota. They figured out that you don't need it. And I love National Voter Registration Day, but we have to think beyond that to IDs. And also, we do a lot of work on education and turnout and like actually getting people to the polls. And it has to be hands-on. Voting is really hard in this country. So we have to work on making every single part of the process more accessible beyond registration.
And that's what really made this whole book just so powerful to me, and how you were enlightened thinking you're going to go and help people get voter ID, and realizing ID is just so much bigger, broader, more vast than that, and is important for so many reasons. And of course, in an hour, we couldn't talk about every single situation nor are we going to, because the point is for you to read the book. But it's such an important conversation, because a lot of times we may talk about, oh, well, how come people aren't voting, or, whatever the case may be, but we have to realize that there is a much bigger picture than just that. And that, no, we may not have poll taxes anymore, or like when I was at the Legacy Center over the weekend. That's Brian Stevens.
The most emotionally challenging museum I have
yes,
ever been to.
Yes. And I actually need to go back, because I was with a group and we went kind of fast, but I do need to go through again and really slow down. But there is a spot in there where once upon a time, you had to take these tests and like how many jelly beans and stuff like that, as ways to try to keep us as, specifically as Black people, from being able to vote in taxes and all these sorts of things. And this is just another form.
100%. It's absolutely a poll tax.
Yep. So just to be aware, I know some people don't like the term, but I'm going to stay woke. Okay. We need to stay woke and stay on top of what's happening. And, if there's any way that we can support, those people who are disenfranchised for one reason or another, to make sure we do that. I'm popping that up there again, because it may just be that you do send a letter. You might not be able to go out and volunteer or whatever, but if you could reach out to the people who are in legislation in your cities and states, that will help a lot and go a long way. So if there's any one last thing that you want everybody to know, Kat, about the book, or about what they can do to help support this wonderful mission that you're on.
My whole goal with writing this book was for people to just know that there's a problem and understand it and be fired up to help. So thank you so much for having me. Please, if you're watching, buy the book. It's only like $18 on Amazon. Also, it's at libraries, or you can request for your library to order it, which is great. And then everybody can share it. Please share it. Also, leave a review on Amazon. The goal is the more that people find out about this, the more that we're going to have the momentum to build a movement to really change it. And so that's what this book is about. And so please, please, please read it. It's short. It's funny. It's pink. It's very pink. So it's cute to walk around with. But I appreciate it. And watching this for an hour, you've already done so much. But this is my life's mission. But really, I think we can all see how it would make our country so much better if we just made sure that everyone had an ID. And so I am trying to, build a movement. So please join it.
Yes, yes. And on that note, we thank you, Kat. We thank you for
Thank
everyone
you.
who's watching live, or and for those who are going to watch it later. Please share this out. Please pick up the book as well, because it's just such an important conversation. And as I said, I read a lot, talk to a lot of people, but this one's like my mind was so blown, and even the people that I talked to about it earlier, they were like speechless. Like, say what? Say huh? What? So it is something that, with awareness, there comes a certain level of responsibility, but you can decide, how far you want to go in that responsibility to help others, because the show is called Live Well, Sister, but people with IDs oftentimes can't live as well, sisters or brothers.
Yep.
So let's just keep that in mind. And we really do look forward to seeing you again here real soon. Thank you again, Kat. I appreciate you. I just need you to hold on for me for a second. We're going to let everybody else go, but thank you
so much. Thank you.
Appreciate you, and keep doing this wonderful work that you are doing. All right. And for everyone else, you all have a wonderful night or morning or afternoon. Spread the word, buy the book. And I look forward to seeing you again here real soon. Take care. Bye-bye.